Thanks for attending this presentation. My name is Benami, and I'm an assistant professor in the Agricultural and Applied Economics Department of Virginia Tech and an affiliate of the Stanford Regulation, Evaluation, and Governance Lab, of which my collaborators on this work, Reed Whitaker, Nicole Lin, Vincent Law, Brandon Anderson, and Dan Ho, are all a part. And as machine learning has been deployed across a broader number of sectors, so has concern mounted about the ethics of its usage, as indicated by this headline. And this has led to additional questions about if and whether government is ready for AI. Yet, perhaps the question should not be so much about whether they're ready for it, but how it can be deployed in an effective and responsible way as government spending ramps up into the billions. And so not only has spending increased, but recent work by a team of colleagues at Stanford and NYU, in which they conducted extensive interviews across federal government agencies, led them to find that nearly half of federal agencies have deployed machine learning and/or AI across a wide range of tasks and with varying degrees of sophistication. And typically, these tools are seen as an opportunity to enhance efficiency and extend limited resources. At the same time, while some algorithmic deployments have generated concern about distributive impacts and equity concerns, in this paper, we seek to demonstrate how algorithmic design can help surface important decisions that might otherwise be hidden, but that affect how and where government resources are allocated. So while there are many such cases that have been discussed within the context of criminal justice, there are a huge set of government tasks that present similar problems. And in the very general case, let's put ourselves in the shoes of a regulator. Once a piece of legislation is passed, regulators are tasked with the implementation of a big, socially important issue to resolve, and they have to make a ton of different decisions and administrative actions with a fairly limited set of resources. Within the context of the US and the Clean Water Act, which is one of the premier pieces of surface water regulation in the US, one of the big issues that regulators face is that of noncompliance. Through the Clean Water Act, federal and state level environmental agencies are mandated to restore and maintain the integrity of surface waters in the US. So think lakes and rivers and streams. And to do this, they can deploy a variety of enforcement resources. Think inspections, training programs, civil penalties, and in some cases, even criminal penalties. The challenge they face in ensuring compliance, though, is very real and very hard, as environmental noncompliance remains pervasive. For example, over the last 8 years, 60 to 75% of major facilities with Clean Water Act permits, so think of some of the largest and highest impact power plants and wastewater treatment facilities, have reported themselves that they are out of compliance with federal law. In addition, 20 to 30% of individually permitted facilities are in significant noncompliance in any given quarter, implying either severe and/or consistent permit violations. Despite this, the budgets of environmental agencies are consistently under threat, with requests to do more with fewer resources. In recognition of this massive noncompliance problem, back in 2018, the federal EPA launched a program to cut the significant noncompliance rate by half. This was a pioneering initiative relative to prior efforts that were generally sector or facility type specific, as well as this goal extended the scope of enforcement priorities to include 7 times the number of facilities. And to aid in this effort, the Reg Lab, of which my co-authors and I are all a part, has stood up a collaboration with the federal EPA to prototype and evaluate machine learning methods to improve compliance with the Clean Water Act. As machine learning then enters into the public sector, we found ourselves engaging in this process as well as examining a series of policy choices that are in effect also questions of algorithmic design. The two we end up focusing in on this paper are first, how is the targeted population defined? So what is the scope to include? As well as second, what is the machine learning model objective, or how should we encode the goal in a machine learning framework? We then consider how decisions around each of these two questions affects what areas may be targeted for compliance resources and the types of disparate impact that may arise from these decisions. As an interdisciplinary team of academics, our work links and builds on several different literatures and communities, including the accountability of algorithmic tools, environmental justice, administrative law, and regulatory enforcement, each of which is an inter- or transdisciplinary field of inquiry in and of itself. So how did we go about addressing these questions that we asked about before? First, I want to orient you to this map here on the left, which shows census block groups in San Mateo County, California. Within this, we see census block groups color-coded by median household incomes, where darker colors indicate wealthier census block groups, and the orange dots reflect the Clean Water Act regulated facilities. Then when you consider the location of these facilities within census block groups, in this histogram, we see that consistent with previous literature on pollution and facility siting, NIPDs, or Clean Water Act regulated facilities, tend to be located in census block groups at the lower end of the income distribution, indicated by these salmon-colored bars concentrated in the left lower side of the graphic. Now, this phenomenon has been well documented in the environmental justice literature. What we aim to help show in this paper is that even given this distribution of the siting of facilities, there's still profound discretion in algorithmic design that can mitigate or exacerbate concerns about disparate impact. In other words, among all these orange dots indicating facilities, we examine how shifting what's included in our prediction models shifts the composition of the communities that end up being targeted for additional compliance resources. And to address these prediction questions, we first drew upon the NIPD's permit compliance system data, which, at least as of a few years ago, was considered by one EPA official to be quite possibly the largest governmental database outside of the IRS, and has quite a bit of information about regulated facilities that permitted emissions and realized effluent in a given time period. To make this more concrete, the data we've brought together and are analyzing from the system contains over 200 million records, assembled from varying data sets from 2000 through to the end of 2019, and includes information on monitoring reports for each permitted effluent, facility level information, compliance status, and enforcement history for the Clean Water Act, as well as non-Clean Water Act compliance status and enforcement history. So think of things like the Clean Air Act. And a simplified process for working through this data is as follows. First, we extracted a variety of information from the NIPD's Integrated Compliance Information System, including details from periodic self-reports submitted to environmental agencies about the volume of emissions that are encapsulated in these discharge monitoring reports. We also included facility features such as the location and permit types and total flow, and historic compliance status information. Now, monthly discharge reports themselves are rather unwieldy since we have multiple discharge locations and thousands of emissions types to manage, which means that the feature space quickly explodes and dimensionality reduction is quite important. So to pursue with this approach, we use data from each of these DMR reports to structure and conduct a structured time series analysis. In other words, using information from the prior time periods, we convert these DMRs into a time series forecast of pollution amounts for the first quarter of the fiscal year 2020, and then we aggregate those emissions up to the facility level. We then merge all the data from these varying data sets together so that the final merged data set is uniquely identified at the facility level. From there, we run two models, which are otherwise the same except in their objective. One is focused in on evaluating the probability of falling into significant noncompliance, and the other is focused on predicting the amount of pollution over the permitted limit. We then rank order all the predictions of these facilities from both of these models, and consistent with the idea of having this significant noncompliance rate, we then select the top 50% under both the regression and classification approaches. We then associate where those facilities are in space and assess the socio-demographic characteristics of the census block groups in which these risk-selected facilities fall, focusing in on the share of minority populations, the median household income, and population density. Our results from this investigation are as follows. This first question that we are investigating surrounds population targeting, or otherwise stated, which category of permits to include within the NCI. So this National Compliance Initiative heralded a large change in shifting the scope of priority of enforcement from sector-specific approaches that often focus in only on large, major facilities to all of individual facilities, major and minor alike. So in broad brushstrokes, majors tend to be large facilities with a high volume of emissions, and minor facilities tend to be smaller with a lower volume of emissions. This expansion in scope was facilitated by the electronic reporting rule, which first applied to individual permits in which both majors and minors fall. Now, there's another class of permits called general permits, which can include a mix of small and large facilities, but that tends to reflect facilities that are somewhat standardized in type. And these will be phased into the electronic reporting rule in subsequent years, closer to 2022. But even once they join into the electronic reporting process, it's unclear if the scope of such a compliance initiative will expand to include them. And this is important because these general permits are quite large in number. And part of what we ask here is what would be missed by not including this volume of permits. To help illustrate and address this question, we first selected a particular type of permitted operation. So here we're showing you permits that were flagged across a number of different databases as sewage wastewater treatment plants. And we mapped out all the permits that had latitudes and longitudes across the continental US in this category. We then examined how many of these wastewater treatment plants were classified as general permits, indicated by the orange dots, and how many as individual permits, since those are the blue dots. And mapping all of these out, we see some striking patterns that seem to be rather discontinuous along state borders, indicating considerable variation in how the facilities with nominally similar functions are treated based on state-level practices for issuing permits. So for example, you can see in this map that North Dakota, West Virginia, Louisiana, and to some extent North Carolina seem to make much more use of general permits for this class facility than other states. And when we then evaluate a sample of the characteristics associated with those permits and how they differ, we find they are actually quite broadly similar in their distributions, as shown by this panel here, which further corroborates the idea that inconsistent decisions on individual versus general categorization of permits influences coverage of otherwise potentially similar facilities that might otherwise fit within the scope of this national goal. The second component we aim to evaluate in this work is that of the model objective. Remember that the National Compliance Initiative's goal was to reduce the significant noncompliance rate by half. This, in effect, encoded the goal into a classification problem. And there are good reasons why a classification policy may be useful, as it could, for example, help address the large number of permits that fall into significant noncompliance due to failing to consistently submit monitoring information. Yet, a sole focus on this rate seemed also potentially at odds with the goal of reducing and enhancing water quality, which seems, as far as we understand, more often relating to the quantity of emissions. So we evaluate this question by examining what changes when you shift the focus of the model from a classification to a regression approach, or from a question about rates to that of amounts, using the types of techniques that I described before. So as to understand how we represent the results to the second question, I first wanted to orient you to the plots, a form of quantile-quantile plot, which we use to illustrate the differences between the distributions of which facilities are targeted under each protocol. When these distributions, so the regression and the classification, are equal, they would fall along the 45-degree line. And in our evaluation, we see such general adherence to the 45-degree line with median household income, where we observe no statistically distinguishable differences between the distributions for regression versus classification protocols, with both median household incomes resting around $57,000 to $58,000 on average. However, when we look at minority populations, we see that the regression approach would target more facilities in census block groups with higher shares of minority populations. On average, the extent of the differences amounts to about a 2% difference in the share of communities with minority populations targeted under this approach, which goes from about 16.7 in the classification approach up to 19% under regression. We also see that classification directs resources to less dense areas. As you can see in this next panel, that there's a notable set of permittees that in the 10 people per square mile or below domain, whereas regression focuses on permittees in areas with population densities that are, on average, nearly 700 people per square mile and above, with a notable number of permittees in places with 1,000 or even 10,000 people per square mile within the 3-mile radius of the permit itself. Overall, these results show that targeting environmental protection based on the intensity of pollution exceedances would focus on areas with higher shares of minority populations in denser, more urban areas. In summary, we see that algorithmic design and evaluation can help identify levers that can help exacerbate or mitigate disparate impacts. And at the same time, it can be very hard to craft a national initiative when the target population can be affected by individual state decisions and discretion. And furthermore, this work reveals that focusing in on pollution amounts would direct more compliance resources towards minority areas in dense urban areas. And while we share this case study in the wild, so to speak, on algorithms and sustainability, additional open questions surfaced through the course of this work include how to aggregate pollution, So first, mirroring the definition of significant noncompliance, our models implicitly assume that every additional percent exceedance can be compared with another percent exceedance of the same category. So what this also implies is that reducing 100 units of phosphorus to 50 would count the same as in percent reduction terms as reducing 1,000 units to 500. Evaluating if and how this is an ideal approach for aggregating pollution impacts for the regression quantity-focused analysis remains an important question. Second, we recognize that the extent of harm from additional pollution may be nonlinear and vary considerably with baseline levels of water quality impairment and vulnerability across regions. So in the paper, we seek to include some measure of vulnerability by including this EJ screen measure, which is an attempt to evaluate areas that face a high degree of pre-existing cumulative exposures and risks. And in doing so, we also find that regression would direct compliance resources towards areas with a higher share of communities with high EJ screen scores. Nonetheless, the goal of translating the coarse measure of emissions over the limit into the social and environmental harms of the context in which they are discharged into is an important, even if challenging, area of research. Finally, we make no suggestion in this work about the appropriate way to actually go about pursuing compliance. Some mixture of information, incentives, and penalties, or carrots and sticks, may be needed in order to induce compliance. And each of these could have further distributive consequences, especially with sticks that could further penalize an area whose compliance stems from insufficient resources. Notwithstanding these limitations, the core of our argument is essentially this. Using a seemingly simple and clear objective, such as this 50% reduction in significant noncompliance, can embed further important policy decisions. For, as we saw from our results, using a national compliance initiative that is focused on individual permits and a classification model, so trying to reduce the rate, has the net effect of directing resources away from more dense urban areas with higher shares of minority populations. And so as the EPA faces this enormous task to improve environmental quality, in this work we seek to demonstrate how algorithmic design can help regulators identify opportunities to mitigate disparate impact as they also enhance their efficiency. We also reflect on how this type of work is only possible with the commitment to transparently investigate the possibilities and impacts of machine learning design and deployment. While we provide a case of environmental sustainability with the recent executive orders that focus in on environmental justice as well as trustworthy AI in government, these open up opportunities for this very community to help address the persistent capacity constraints within government so as to ensure that the principles of fairness, accountability, and transparency are featured in the deployment as well as design of machine learning in public policy. So thank you all for listening, and thanks all to the wonderful interdisciplinary team. It was a joy to work with. I look forward to your questions in the Q&A section, and of course, feel free to reach out with additional questions outside of that window as well.